When lost souls collide in the darkest hour, can a single moment of trust spark a rescue, or will fear win again? On a storm-lashed night in Cedar Valley, a reclusive officer and his wounded German shepherd believe they've lost faith in people, until fate drags them into a rescue that will haunt you. Deep in the woods, two young sisters are trapped beneath a fallen tree, abandoned by everyone who should have cared. What unfolds next is not a story of heroes, but of scarred souls daring to trust again. One silent act, one small kindness at a time. Are you ready to believe in the quiet power of staying? Cedar Valley never made a fuss, even as late autumn bled quietly into winter. The town pressed itself against the foothills and pine, tucked between slow, gray rivers and hills the color of old pewter. On that evening, dusk came early. The clouds had gathered and settled low over the rooftops, not yet releasing their burden, but threatening. Along Main Street, porch lights flickered on before dinner, then were swallowed by the heavy, slanting light. Elliot Turner's house stood at the edge of town, just beyond the last gas station, where the land curved away from the river and the grass always seemed a shade more reluctant. The house was small, clapboard, its paint dulled by decades of rain and wind, its windows always a little fogged around the edges. Nothing in the home clamored for attention. Everything lived in a hush. From the kitchen chairs with their fraying seats to the worn blue blanket draped over the arm of the old sofa. There was no television sound, no laughter echoing down the hallway. Just the gentle ticking of a battered wall clock, a sound that became background to Elliot's life the way old injuries become background to the body. That afternoon, Elliot moved through his routines as if they were an incantation against loneliness. His boots thudded softly against the wooden floor. He wiped the table, set a kettle to boil, and folded laundry with the careful, practiced hands of someone who'd had to learn the value of order when nothing else made sense. When he entered the living room, he paused a moment at the window. Through the warped glass, he watched the wind comb the field behind his house, bending brittle grass and stirring the last fallen leaves across the yard. His gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, to a photograph propped near the lamp. A family gathered by a river, sun on their faces, one empty chair in the background. The air in the room shifted, heavy and familiar, the way it always did when memory pressed in. In the far corner, Harlow sat at the base of the window, one paw curled beneath his chest, his gaze tracking the slow drift of clouds. The German shepherd's coat, nearly black along the spine, softened to rust and honey at the legs, and on his right hind leg, a long, puckered scar twisted the fur in a way that drew the eye, but never the sympathy. Harlow was a dog who did not ask for comfort, only company. His left ear, nicked from some old wound, tilted to catch the smallest sound, a distant engine, a squirrel scurrying along the fence, the sigh of the wind. There was a gravity to the dog, an awareness. In the way he held himself, in the rare way he met a person's gaze, you could see the ghost of work he used to do, finding the lost, carrying news of hope or heartbreak through the debris of a world already broken. As dusk deepened, the stillness inside grew more pronounced. Elliot set Harlow's old, worn blanket on the living room floor, smoothing it with the flat of his palm. He paused, feeling the raised threads, thinking of nights past when another voice had called Harlow to the blanket, his wife or his daughter before the flood, before the world shrank down to just the two of them. That was the strange truth of loss. It made the world smaller, not bigger. It hollowed things out, left only echoes and old habits. And sometimes, if you were lucky, the steady presence of a dog who kept choosing to stay. Outside, the temperature dropped, sharp and sudden, and the rain finally began. A fine, drifting mist that tapped at the window but never rushed. Elliot flicked on a lamp, the light pooling gold and gentle, and sat for a while in his usual chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a thumb. He looked tired in the way that people do when they no longer expect anything to change. His shoulders, broad but stooped, bore the weight of years not spent in battle, but in waiting. The waiting for news, for healing, for the world to right itself. He didn't dwell on it, not outwardly. He'd learned, long ago, that wounds left untended will still close over, but never quite right. Harlow shifted on the blanket, letting out a long breath, the sound soft as linen. His gaze lingered on Elliot, then flicked away toward the window, as if he too sensed something on the edge of the world, a change in the weather or in fate. For a while nothing moved except the shadows. Across the town, out past the playground swallowed in weeds, and beyond the crumbling rail fence the woods stretched dense and indifferent. Under the boughs, two small figures moved between the trees, blending into the wet underbrush. They wore coats several sizes too large, the fabric dark with rain and mud, hoods pulled low. Rose, the taller of the two, led with a kind of silent determination, her hand clamped firmly around Mila's. They moved as one, no words between them, just the soft crunch of boots on old leaves and the quick, nervous glances back toward the distant light of houses now out of reach. The hunger in their bellies was a quiet ache, but the fear of being seen was sharper still. No one waited for them at home. No one called after them as the evening fell. The girls walked until the edge of the woods closed behind them, until the world was just the two of them and the rhythm of breath and footstep, the ghostly calls of crows overhead, the growing dark. Mila stumbled once, and Rose tightened her grip, not scolding, just pulling her sister closer, the way children do when no adults remain to draw the circle of safety. Back in Elliot's house, the rain became steadier. He reached for the kettle, poured hot water over a bag of tea, and stood, unmoving, for a long moment, watching the steam curl in the faint glow. Harlow padded over, nudging his nose against Elliot's leg, just once, then returning to his vigil at the window. There was no need for words. Between them a quiet pact. Neither would leave, no matter how empty the house became. As night fell, a hush settled over Cedar Valley, thick as velvet. Beyond the safety of walls, the wind rose, pulling at the eaves, rattling the storm door. Elliot glanced again at the photo on the mantel, then at the dog at his feet, and in the spaces between heartbeats, he let himself feel, just for a moment, the ache of all he had lost, and the strange, stubborn hope of the presence that remained. In the woods, Rose and Mila pressed deeper, swallowed by shadow, the first real drops of rain soaking their hair, their skin, their resolve. The world was shrinking around them, but still, they walked. The woods along Cedar Creek didn't belong to anyone, but after dark, they became a different country. The path that Rose and Mila followed was not a trail, only a narrow seam where deer had pressed through over years of quiet passage. The girls did not walk quickly. They moved with a kind of fatigue that adults sometimes mistake for stubbornness, but which in children is just the last thread of hope not yet frayed. Every few yards Rose paused to look back. Never for people, always for danger. Headlights, the low drone of an engine, the gleam of a flashlight that wasn't safety but threat. But there was only rain now, and the trees closing in, and the faint promise of water ahead. Rose was 8, though she felt much older, her hands already calloused in places from climbing fences and foraging behind grocery stores. Her knees perpetually scraped and bruised. Her face, still soft with childhood, was streaked with the dust and dried mud of long afternoons hiding beneath back porches. Her hair, sun-bright under all that dirt, hung in uneven strands around her jaw, and her cheeks, once round, had grown hollow. Mila, smaller, frailer, clung to her sister's side, breathing shallow, her lips tinged blue from cold. Her eyes were wide, not frightened exactly, but vacant, a gaze learned by watching adults ignore what they could not bear to fix. The girl's boots squelched through a patch of moss, and Mila stumbled again, saw Rose bent down, wordless, and untangled a knot of shoelace with numb fingers. She looked up once, briefly, to see her sister's lips pressed thin, her brows pinched against the chill that had begun to seep into their bones. Neither spoke. There was no need. They moved on. As the rain picked up, the cold took on a new edge. It was no longer the ordinary shiver of early winter. It was a biting, wet ache that worked its way beneath the skin, settling in the space between ribs. Mila's teeth chattered. Rose scanned the undergrowth, searching for anything. A dry patch, a hollow in the roots, somewhere to rest, somewhere to feel less exposed. Instead, she found a stone, smooth and round, nestled in the mud by the creek. With the kind of small authority that only older siblings possess, she picked it up, wiped it clean on her sleeve, and pressed it into Mila's palm. "Keep this in your mouth," she mouthed silently, miming, a memory from when their mother had done the same during lean days. "It'll trick your belly. Helps with the hunger." Mila didn't question. She placed the stone in her mouth, the gesture as automatic as breathing, and sucked on it quietly, the way she might have done with candy, years ago, in another life. There was a dull pride in Rose's chest at this small act, some comfort offered, even as her own stomach twisted with emptiness. They followed the sound of water, first a trickle, then a soft rushing, until the creek came into view, wide and sluggish in the fading light. They crouched by the edge, Rose holding Mila steady as the younger girl scooped water into her mouth with cupped hands. The water was cold, almost sweet. Above them, the sky pressed lower, heavy with promise. Rain pattered on the hoods of their coats, gathered in droplets at their eyelashes, streaked dirt down their cheeks. Rose watched the circles form on the surface of the creek, watched as a single leaf tumbled past, caught in the current. Behind them, the trees groaned as the wind picked up. Night animals rustled through the brush, rabbits perhaps, or the nervous scurry of a raccoon. The girls paid no mind. They had learned early that most creatures in the dark wanted nothing to do with children. It was people you watched for, the echo of boots on gravel, the sharp bark of orders meant for someone else. The ache of that knowing sat between them like a third presence. The world narrowed to the rhythm of moving forward. Mila's steps slowed. Rose gripped her sister's hand more tightly, glancing at the swelling of her knuckles. Mila's shoes had lost their lining long ago, and each step now left a smudge of red across the pale brown mud, a wound, not a warning, but an inevitability. Rose did not pause to comfort. Comfort was a thing for later, for when they could afford to stop. The forest's hush pressed close, broken only by the snap of twigs and the distant call of a crow. The silence was not peaceful. It was thick, almost menacing, and Rose felt it in her chest, a weight building as the dark crept in. Still, she kept walking, counting the steps, marking the rhythm, clinging to the memory of their mother's hand on her shoulder. The bedtime stories told in whispers so their father wouldn't hear. The memory was dim, but it glimmered, enough to keep her moving, enough to remind her what it was to be loved. once. A patch of ferns bent low by the rain became their next refuge. Rose pulled Mila down beside her, wrapping one arm across her sister's shoulders. She listened to the night, to the gentle drip of rain from the leaves, to the slow, uneven breaths beside her. She waited, watching as Mila's eyelids fluttered, then closed, not in peace but in exhaustion. For a long while Rose said nothing, did nothing, only watched the moon as it struggled to break through the clouds, her fingers tracing shapes in the dirt, patterns she couldn't name, the only marks of herself left in the world. And in that quiet, where the world felt impossibly big and impossibly empty, Rose's face changed. The last of her certainty melted, leaving only a child again, small, alone, battered by rain and silence. She pressed her cheek to Mila's shoulder, eyes squeezed shut, letting the cold and the dark wash over her, hoping that in the morning, if morning came, they would be found. Back in Cedar Valley, the rain rattled the windows of Elliot Turner's house. Inside, Harlow's ears flicked at the sound of thunder far off. Elliot moved through the motions of night, setting out a bowl of water for the dog, checking locks he already knew were secure. He had no way of knowing that just beyond the woods, 2 children sat beneath the dripping trees, small and silent, hoping for mercy from a world that had not yet offered it. In the space between, the storm gathered its strength. The woods waited, and the next page of their story, whatever it was, remained unwritten, suspended in the hush that comes before calamity or salvation. In the woods, the hush of waiting became a prelude. The rain that had begun as a gentle mist now thickened, drops spattering on Mila's brow, soaking into Rose's sleeves until the fabric clung, heavy and chill. Above the girls, branches swayed against the wind, sighing in a language older than fear. Rose, legs tucked close, tried to keep Mila's head dry by lifting the edge of her own coat, but water ran in steady trickles down her spine. There was no telling how much time passed, only that the blue-gray twilight faded into something darker, colder. Every so often, Rose's head bobbed, her body demanding sleep, but every time her chin dipped, the cold would snap her awake. She listened to Mila's breathing, counting the seconds between each shallow inhale. The stone was still clutched in Mila's hand, warm now from the heat of her palm. Occasionally, her fingers twitched, grasping at air. Wind built between the trunks, low at first, then rising, shaking loose the last brittle leaves. Rose lifted her head, startled by a sudden branch breaking in the distance, a crack that seemed to echo much closer in the quiet. Mila stirred but did not wake, and then, without warning, the night broke open. It started with a rumble so deep it seemed to come from beneath the earth. The trees shuddered, the ground itself seeming to tremble as the wind whipped around them. Rain drove sideways, stinging skin, blurring the lines of the world into streaks of gray. Rose blinked water from her eyes. She tried to pull Mila closer, but the ground beneath them had become slick, mud oozing up around her shoes. A flash of lightning revealed the roots of a massive tree, an old fir, taller than any other on this stretch of woods, its trunk glistening with rain, its limbs splayed wide like a figure in a dream. There was a groan, loud as grief, then the crack and scream of splintering wood. Rose turned, grabbing Mila's arm, but before she could drag her sister to safety, a thunderous weight crashed through the air. The world narrowed to chaos, shattering limbs, the splatter of cold mud, a jolt of pain as Rose was knocked onto her side, face pressed into the wet earth. A thick branch landed hard across Mila's lower leg, pinning her to the ground. Rose, stunned, blinked through a haze of rain and fear. Mila's mouth formed a silent scream, her eyes wide and bright as glass. Everything else was lost to the storm. The tree, older than memory, had fallen, its limbs tangled with others, its trunk blocking out even the thin, uncertain light. The smell of crushed pine needles, sharp and green, rose up through the rain. Rose scrambled, mud up to her elbows, trying to move the branch, but it wouldn't give. She pushed, pulled, her hands slipping. Mila's breathing turned ragged, then shallow. Rose's own voice, she realized, was nothing more than a choked gasp, the sound drowned by thunder. Her tears mixed with the rain. For a long moment, she lay across her sister's legs, heart thudding, wishing someone would come, anyone, but knowing better. The last time she had called for help had been the night their mother didn't wake up, and no one answered. "Don't sleep, Mila," Rose finally managed, voice barely more than a whisper in the roaring dark. She tried to hold Mila upright, keep her awake, but the younger girl's head lolled, her lips moving without sound. Her small fingers tightened once, then went slack. In the near distance, unseen, the storm pressed deeper into the valley. Lightning flashed, illuminating the wreckage for a split second. The broken tree, the two small bodies huddled together beneath its ruin, the wide, wild look in Rose's eyes. Mila whimpered once, the sound swallowed by the howl of wind. There was no shelter here, only the bitter press of cold and the relentless battering of rain. The mud rose, caking Mila's shoes, soaking through Rose's sleeves. The girls' hair clung to their cheeks, rainwater streaming into their eyes. Rose's knees shook, the effort of holding herself up and of holding on to hope too great. The forest, always indifferent, closed around them, the storm's voice rattling through the branches, making everything seem small, too small to matter, too far from help, too fragile to survive. Still, Rose did not leave her sister. She leaned close, pressing her cheek against Mila's, whispering nonsense. Words from bedtime stories, half-remembered lyrics, anything to keep the world from going silent. She remembered suddenly, a night before their mother died. The two of them, curled on a mattress near a leaking window, rain tapping out a lullaby on the glass. Their mother had hummed softly, brushing Mila's hair back with slow, patient fingers. In the memory, she'd felt safe. Here now she tried to borrow that safety, tried to wrap it around them, but it was only an echo, thin and slipping away. The night wore on. The storm, unkind, showed no mercy. Rose's hands were numb, her legs trembling from cold and fear and the weight of the branch. She tried again to lift it, using every ounce of strength, but nothing changed except the sharp pain that lanced up her arm. She didn't cry out, just set her jaw and held Mila tighter. Rainwater filled the low places in the ground. The girl's breath steamed, barely visible in the brief flashes of light. Mila drifted in and out, her face gone pale as milk, lips tinged with blue. Rose could only watch, helpless, her own hope a shrinking thing inside her chest. When the thunder faded, only the wind remained, and with it, the waiting. Rose, exhausted, pressed her forehead to her sister's, breathing with her, for her, so neither of them would be left alone. In the world beyond, no one called their names. No search parties walked the roads. There was no beacon, no promise, only the empty hush of a storm that did not care. But somewhere, not yet near enough, a light, faint as a thought, had begun to move through the dark, and with it, the chance that even the lost might be found. The storm pressed harder against Cedar Valley, shrouding the town in a cold, relentless hush. At the Turner house, the lights glowed gold in the windows, but the warmth inside seemed fragile, as if it could be swept away by one more gust of wind. Elliot moved through the kitchen on muscle memory, rinsing his mug, draping Harlow's towel over the radiator, checking the lock on the back door for the third time. There was nothing left to do but wait out the rain. But waiting had always been the hardest part. He lingered in the small garage, the faint scent of engine oil and old grass clippings filling the air. Shelves lined with canning jars, extra boots, the detritus of a life that had shrunk to essentials. Elliot's gaze lingered on the heavy winter coat hanging by the door, its pocket weighted by an unopened letter he never intended to read. He brushed past it and reached for the light switch. Harlow had followed him in, silent as a shadow. The old shepherd paused at the threshold, ears pricked toward the wildness outside. Rain hammered the roof, tapping an anxious rhythm. For a long moment, the two simply stood, man and dog, each caught in the quiet tangle of their own thoughts. Elliot bent to wipe a muddy print from the garage floor. The ache in his knees protested, but he did not hurry. Then Harlow moved. It wasn't a bark, not at first, just a lift of the head, a tense ripple down his spine. The dog's body stilled, then vibrated with alertness, his nose twitching toward the Wendenarstan curling in beneath the door. Elliot paused, one hand on the rag, feeling the air shift, as if some message had arrived on the current. A warning or a plea, he could not say. Harlow's eyes, dark and steady, met his, holding them a long beat. There was an urgency there, but not panic. A question, but not confusion. "Easy," Elliot murmured, the word more habit than command. But Harlow did not settle. He turned his head toward the door, then back to Elliot, then to the door again, tail held low but firm, his whole body quivering with the intensity of something unseen. When the shepherd finally moved, it was sudden, a quick pivot, nails clicking on concrete. He nosed the door, shoulders bunched, ready. Elliot's own body went tense, muscles recalling old instincts. Without thinking, he shrugged into the winter coat, slipped the flashlight into his pocket, then hesitated by the bench to grab Harlow's old blue collar and the faded leash, even though the dog rarely needed it. He nearly left the old wool scarf, but then, memory like a chill, he wrapped it twice around his neck. The air outside struck him at once, raw and electric, smelling of ozone and pine and the faint iron tang of earth being turned by rain. Harlow bolted ahead, pausing at the end of the drive, head cocked as if listening for something only he could hear. Elliot pulled the door shut behind him, the click muffled by the howling wind, and stepped into the storm. It was night in every direction. The streetlights glowed against the downpour, their halos caught in sheets of water. Elliot followed Harlow without question, boots finding their own path through puddles and mud, the leash slack but ever present. They cut across the back garden, past the patch of frost-bitten carrots and the old apple tree, its branches stripped bare but for a single stubborn leaf. The world contracted to what could be felt, not seen, the cold air needling his cheeks, the sound of Harlow's breath just ahead, the weight of memory shifting in his chest. With each step, the road behind them fell away, swallowed by darkness and rain. As they reached the edge of town, the familiar lines of houses disappeared, replaced by the wild tangle of brush and undergrowth. Harlow paused at the break in the fence, his body still, every sense straining forward. Elliot hesitated only a moment before following, ducking under the splintered wood, the beam of his flashlight flickering across wet leaves and glistening stones. They entered the woods as if crossing a threshold, man and dog, each carrying their own scars, neither truly expecting to find what they needed. The rain muffled the rest of the world. Branches snagged Elliot's coat. Mud sucked at his boots. Harlow moved with purpose, nose low, weaving through the bracken, not running but never wavering. Elliot's breathing quickened with exertion and something else, a familiar dread he had learned to carry quietly, the way men of his age carried regret. The only sound was the rain, the steady pad of Harlow's paws, and the distant rumble of thunder rolling out along the valley. At times, Elliot's flashlight caught the shimmer of animal eyes, deer, perhaps, or raccoon, reflecting the small light and then vanishing. There was no spoken conversation, only a current of silent understanding. Elliot trusted Harlow's instincts, just as he had learned to trust the slow work of his own hands, the stubborn pulse of his own heart. Both had known what it was to be abandoned by the world's kindness. Both had, in their own way, survived. The further they went, the more the night seemed to close around them. Shadows bent and pooled. The path became less distinct. Harlow paused, sniffing the air, then veered left, deeper into the thick of the woods. Elliot stumbled once, his knee jolting sharp against a root, but he did not stop. He could not have said why he kept going, why on this particular night he answered a summons with no voice, trusted a dog's urgency over the safety of a locked door. Maybe it was the quiet ache that had settled into his life, the recognition of loss in the eyes of an old animal who had also known too many goodbyes. Maybe it was only the weather, or a need to believe that somewhere, for someone, it still mattered to show up. Harlow stopped abruptly, head high, tail rigid. Elliot stilled beside him, his own breath clouding in the cold air. For a long moment, they waited, the world reduced to the flicker of the flashlight, the press of rain, the silent bond between wounded souls. Something out there needed them. That much, at least, was clear. And so, together, they stepped further into the darkness, two shadows moving through the storm, each marked by their scars, each quietly refusing to leave the other behind. It was as if the rain had erased every landmark, leaving only the sensation of wetness, the ache of cold, and the throb of anxiety. Elliot followed Harlow's movements by feel as much as sight. The forest was alive with the rush of wind and the whisper of rain through pine needles, but it was a life apart, something untroubled by human worry. They moved steadily, with Harlow pausing every few yards to sniff, to listen. At times the dog would stop, body tense, ears angled forward, as if waiting for a voice only he could hear. Elliot had learned, over the years, to trust these pauses. Harlow had saved lives before, sometimes with little more than the tilt of his head, or the way his body stiffened in a hallway thick with smoke. Tonight, it was only the two of them, but something in the air felt like an echo of those old emergencies, a memory of hope, battered and thin, but present. Elliot's flashlight cut through the woods in sharp, trembling slices, illuminating branches slick with rain, tangled brambles, and the glistening swell of mud. His breath misted as he moved, hands cold inside his gloves, the ache in his knee flaring with every step. Each time the light flickered across Harlow's fur, Elliot felt steadier, anchored by the dog's calm determination. They had walked deeper than Elliot expected, away from the known trails, into a place where the trees crowded close and the path dissolved into marsh and undergrowth. The night pressed in, water dripped from his collar. Elliot pressed on, feeling the fatigue settle into his shoulders. At some point, he stopped checking his watch. Time had become irrelevant, replaced by the rhythm of rain and the sound of his own boots squelching in the dark. And then, Harlow froze. Elliot nearly walked into him. The leash suddenly taut. Harlow's body was rigid, nose lifted into the air, nostrils flaring. He took a step forward, head low, tail straight, then glanced back as if to say, "Here." Elliot's chest tightened. He followed, careful now, ducking beneath a branch heavy with rain. Ahead, the beam of his flashlight flickered, then steadied, revealing a tangle of brush, a fallen fir, and beneath its thickest limb, something that did not belong to the forest, a flash of gold, a hand pale and muddy, outstretched, blonde hair tangled with pine needles and earth. Elliot's heart hammered. He crouched low, ignoring the chill that crept through his jeans and swept the beam of his light over the scene. Two children. One was curled tight, eyes wide and unblinking, body half concealed beneath a blue coat several sizes too large. The other, smaller, lay partly beneath the branch, her leg trapped at an unnatural angle. Rain pooled beneath her, soaking the hem of her jeans and darkening the mud around her foot. Both were silent. Both looked up at him as if he might disappear at any moment, a trick of the storm and their own desperate hope. Harlow approached first. He did not bark, nor did he bound forward with the reckless energy of a younger dog. Instead, he moved slowly, lowering himself to the ground, his great head level with the girl's, his breathing soft and measured. He waited, tail sweeping a gentle arc in the wet leaves. Rose, the older girl, flinched at first, shrinking back, but when she saw Harlow's calm gaze, she didn't run. Instead, she looked to her sister, as if asking permission for both of them to trust again. The younger girl, Mila, whimpered, a faint sound that barely reached Elliot's ears. Elliot set the flashlight down, letting it rest on a patch of moss so the light fanned out wide. He moved forward, slow and unthreatening, water streaming from his sleeves. Kneeling in the mud, he took stock. Rose's arm was scraped and trembling. Mila's foot twisted beneath the limb, her breath ragged. He reached for the scarf around his neck, his daughter's old wool still carrying the faint scent of home, and gently draped it over Mila's shoulders. His hands, big and rough, moved carefully, no sudden movements. He brushed the girl's hair back, felt the heat of fever starting at her temple. Harlow lay down beside Mila, pressing his side against her. The warmth of his body seeped into the shivering child, his head resting lightly on her knee as if to say, "You're not alone." The contact seemed to steady her, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment before reopening. Rose, shaking, pressed closer to her sister, then, tentatively, rested her hand on Harlow's back. The dog didn't move, just breathed, deep and even, as if anchoring all three of them to this spot of earth. Elliot examined the branch pinning Mila's leg. It was too heavy to move with one hand, too awkward in the mud to lift easily. He looked at Rose. She stared back, silent, jaw clenched, eyes daring him to make a promise he couldn't keep. Elliot nodded, not with assurance but with recognition. "We will try." He worked quietly, sliding a sturdy stick beneath the branch for leverage, bracing his foot against a root. Rain slid down his face, gathering in the collar of his coat, but he ignored it. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pressed down, shifting the weight, feeling the branch begin to lift. Mila whimpered again, and Harlow nosed her shoulder, staying close. When the limb finally moved enough, Elliot slipped his arm beneath Mila's back, lifting her free. She gasped, clinging to his coat, her small fingers digging in, but did not cry out. Rose reached for her sister's hand, holding tight, as if letting go now might break the spell that had kept them together through the night. There were no words spoken, only the hush of rain, the panting of Harlow, and the quick, shuddering breaths of two children who had gone as far as their hope could take them. Elliot gathered Mila in his arms, wrapping the scarf tighter, feeling her head fall heavy against his chest. Rose pressed in beside him, still clutching Harlow's fur, and for a long moment, the four of them knelt together beneath the broken tree, a tableau of wounds, old and new, joined not by certainty, but by the small, trembling trust that can begin in the darkness, when all else seems lost. Harlow stood and nudged Elliot's elbow, ready to lead the way. Elliot nodded and without fanfare followed. The woods stretched before them, but for the first time that night, the path home, though uncertain, seemed possible. The rain showed no sign of stopping. It slicked the branches and churned the earth beneath Elliot's boots, washing away any trace of their steps as soon as they passed. Elliot carried Mila in his arms, her weight slight but heavy with worry. Her breath was shallow against his neck, warm despite the chill. Rose walked close, one hand still clutching a fistful of Harlow's fur, as if the dog were a lifeline spun from another world. Harlow trotted beside them, body pressed close to the children, watchful and silent. The forest that had seemed vast and merciless only minutes ago now shrank to the small circle of light cast by Elliot's flashlight and the measured sound of their footsteps. Each step away from the fallen tree felt like a thread pulled free from the tangle of fear. Still, the journey was slow, every root and stone a challenge beneath the mud. Elliot's knees ached, but he did not pause. They found brief shelter beneath the overhang of an old storage shed, half collapsed but still standing. Elliot set Mila down gently on a dry patch of concrete, her body curling instinctively toward Harlow, who laid his head beside her hip and did not move. For a few breaths, the world felt suspended, nothing but the sound of rain on metal and the trembling warmth of small bodies huddled together. Elliot shrugged off his coat, wringing water from the cuffs, then draped it over Mila and Rose, tucking the edges in tight. His own shirt clung to his back, cold and rough, but he ignored the discomfort. He knelt beside Rose and Mila, hands steady as he checked the makeshift bandage at Mila's ankle. It wasn't much, just his daughter's old scarf, knotted gently, already soaked through. He looked at Mila's face, the drawn lines of pain and exhaustion, and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. Still warm, but not burning. She watched him with half-closed eyes, unblinking, as if afraid any sudden movement might break the fragile peace that had settled over them. Rose, silent all this time, sat upright, her posture rigid. She watched every movement, eyes darting between Elliot's face and Mila's. Harlow, sensing the tension, shifted closer, his heavy tail thumping once, then settling again. There was a smell in the air, earth, wet leaves, and the faint musk of old wood, that reminded Elliot of nights spent camping with his brother long ago, before loss had remade the world. A flash of lightning revealed the world beyond their shelter. The tangled branches of the forest, the rivulets of water snaking down the bark of a fir tree, the distant glimmer of streetlights barely visible through the downpour. The sight brought a flicker of hope. Town was not far, not if they kept moving. Still, Elliot waited a few moments longer, letting the children rest, letting his own heart settle into a quieter rhythm. He reached into his pocket and found a crumpled granola bar, soft and nearly forgotten. Without a word, he broke it in two and offered the halves, one to Rose, one to Mila. Rose hesitated, then took the piece, nibbling carefully, eyes never leaving her sister. Mila managed a small bite before her eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion overtaking hunger. Elliot's mind worked through the next steps. They needed to keep moving, to reach the road before the cold grew sharper. He studied Mila's ankle, deciding it was not broken, only badly bruised and swollen. With careful hands, he fashioned a splint from a sturdy branch and a length of his own belt, winding it gently so as not to startle her. Mila whimpered, but did not pull away. Harlow nuzzled her cheek in silent comfort. When the rain eased for a moment, Elliot lifted Mila once more, her arms curling around his neck, her breath warm against his collarbone. Rose helped gather the coats and scarf, bundling them as best she could. Elliot nodded at Harlow, and the dog stood, ready. They stepped out from the shed, back into the forest, the path home more a memory than a trail. The walk became a procession of small, determined movements. Rose took the lead, flashlight in hand now, her grip sure despite the tremor in her arms. Harlow flanked Mila, keeping his shoulder against Elliot's leg. The world shrank to their breathing, the soft squelch of mud, the low rumble of thunder far off. At times, Mila murmured in her sleep, fragments of dreams. Elliot heard her mother's name, and his heart clenched. Once, when they paused beneath a cedar, Rose reached out and touched Harlow's ear, stroking it with hesitant fingers. The gesture was small, unnoticed by anyone but the dog. But it was a beginning. Harlow leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly, his breath deepening. Rose did not smile, but her shoulders eased, just a little. They crossed a narrow stream, Elliot wading carefully, holding Mila high above the water. Rose and Harlow hopped from stone to stone, working together, Rose's hand in the dog's fur for balance. At the far bank, Elliot paused, listening to the distant sound of a car, someone driving fast along the main road. Perhaps, or just a trick of the wind. It was almost dawn when the town finally emerged from the shadows. The faint glow of streetlights on wet pavement, the comforting geometry of houses lined up in quiet rows. Elliot's lungs burned with relief, but he kept his pace steady, never rushing, always checking on the girls, on Harlow. The rain had eased to a whisper. At the edge of Cedar Valley, the group paused beneath the awning of a small, abandoned garage. Elliot set Mila down again, letting Rose curl beside her. He watched as the girls huddled together, Harlow pressed against their backs, a shield of warmth and fur. Elliot sat on the curb, elbows on knees, letting the fatigue catch up to him. A sparrow landed nearby, shaking rain from its wings. Elliot watched it for a long time, seeing in its small, stubborn presence a mirror of their own fragile survival. The night had not broken them. The cold had not stolen every comfort. And as dawn crept across the sky, gentle and pale, Elliot felt, just for a moment, the first glimmer of something softer than hope. He reached over, laying his hand atop Harlow's head, and in the quiet that followed, there was no need for words. They had not made it home, not yet, but for now, in this thin pocket of safety, they had found each other. The automatic doors at Cedar Valley Medical Center parted with a quiet sigh, letting in a gust of rain and the battered small procession. Elliot, carrying Mila close, Rose walking with shoulders squared and jaw set, and Harlow trailing at their heels, his fur heavy with water and the smells of pine and storm. The hospital lights were brittle and cold, washing the world into a muted hush that seemed to settle over every surface. Inside, the night staff moved with practiced calm. A nurse at the reception desk looked up, startled for only a breath, then called softly for a gurney. No one asked questions right away. There was a kind of recognition in the air. People who had seen trouble before, who knew that sometimes the stories could wait until the breathing was steady and the wounds were counted. Elliot laid Mila gently onto the waiting stretcher. The little girl's face was pinched with exhaustion and pain, but her eyes fluttered open just long enough to find Rose and Harlow. She reached for her sister, fingers curling in the air until Rose took her hand and held it tight. Harlow pressed his wet nose against Mila's wrist, then stepped back as the nurse wrapped a soft, warm blanket around her, careful not to jostle the injured ankle. Rose followed close as the gurney rolled down the hallway, her own feet heavy and unsure, every muscle aching. Elliot kept pace behind, the hospital's linoleum floor cool under his boots, the thrum of fluorescent lights overhead pressing at the edges of his awareness. At every turn, he glanced for Harlow, who shadowed them with a patience that seemed to steady even the trembling in his own hands. They reached a small room tucked at the end of the pediatric wing, a space painted in fading pastels, stars and moons worn away by years of anxious waiting. A nurse gently lifted Mila onto the bed, checking her vitals, murmuring reassurances that were more tone than content. Rose stood beside the bed, shivering, as another nurse draped a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes never left Mila's face. Elliot remained in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, unsure where to stand or how to fill the sudden emptiness of not needing to move. He watched as the nurses moved around the girls, checking pulses, shining small lights into their eyes. Harlow settled onto the floor by the door, body curled tight, tail sweeping slowly across the tiles. For the first time all night, Elliot realized how old the dog looked. Gray in the muzzle, fur matted with mud, but eyes as steady as always. Rose was offered a chair, too big for her small frame. She curled up in it, legs tucked beneath her, arms wrapped around her knees. Someone brought her a cup of warm water, which she cradled in both hands but barely sipped. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of machines and the distant patter of rain against the window. Rose watched Mila, waiting for a sign, a twitch of a finger, the rise and fall of breath, anything that might mean I'm still here. In the hallway, Elliot spoke with the attending nurse, a woman with silver hair tucked beneath a blue cap. She asked questions softly, jotting notes, never pressing for answers Elliot could not give. Where did you find them? How long were they outside? Did they have family to call? He shook his head. No one I know, he managed, voice rough. The nurse nodded, eyes softening, as if this absence was as common as fever. He returned to the small room and set his coat over the back of Rose's chair. In his shirt pocket, Elliot found a wrapped roll, an old biscuit, forgotten but not spoiled, still fragrant with flour and honey. He placed it quietly on the table beside Rose, not wanting to interrupt her vigil. For a moment, she did not notice. But then, as hunger slowly overpowered fear, she reached for it, broke it in two, and set one piece on the edge of Mila's pillow. Elliot watched her, and in that small act, a crumb of kindness divided. He felt something in his chest loosen. Harlow watched all this from the floor, head resting on his paws. He blinked slowly, eyelids heavy, the fatigue of a long night beginning to show. A nurse passed by and hesitated, considering the dog, but then only smiled, as if understanding that his presence was as necessary as any IV or dose of medicine. Harlow did not move. He seemed to draw the room's worry into himself, grounding it, turning panic into patience. Hours slid past in increments marked by the slow drip of a saline bag, the faint beeping of a monitor, the breathing of children in sleep. The storm faded outside, but the hush inside remained, a kind of holding, where no one spoke above a whisper, where even Elliot's own thoughts felt softened by the quiet. Once, in the deepest part of the night, Rose leaned down and placed her hand gently on Harlow's head. The dog blinked, lifting his eyes to meet hers, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding of loss and of loyalty. Rose held his gaze for a long moment, then curled back up, finally letting herself drift for a little while into uneasy rest. Elliot sat in the hallway, elbows on his knees, feeling the ache in his shoulders settle into a kind of resignation. It was not defeat, but acceptance, a sense that he had done what could be done, that now the world would do as it must. He listened to the soft sounds of the hospital, the shuffling of nurses, the creak of wheels, the distant murmur of a lullaby on someone's phone. As dawn threatened at the windows, the room's silence was interrupted only by the shifting of Harlow on the floor, the gentle brush of Rose's fingers against the blanket, the rise and fall of Mila's breath as she slept. Nothing was resolved, no future promised. But for this night, in this room, 4 strangers, each bearing their own scars, had found a moment of shelter. And as the light grew in the east, Elliot allowed himself to hope, just a little, that sometimes that was enough. Mila woke just after dawn. It wasn't sudden, there was no dramatic gasp or rush of clarity, but rather the slow, uncertain rising of a child out of deep water. Pale morning light slanted through the hospital window, drawing soft gold lines across her blanket and catching the wild whirls of hair at her brow. She blinked, not quite certain if she was awake or still dreaming, then saw Rose curled beside her, and the world steadied itself into something familiar. The room was quiet except for the faint humming of machines and, below that, a deeper rhythm. The steady, even breathing of Harlow sprawled at the foot of the bed. His chest rose and fell in gentle waves, fur dark and matted with traces of the night's storm. One of his paws twitched as he dreamed. The dog's silent company made the sterile room feel less foreign, less a place of endings and more a place where something might begin again. Rose stirred too, blinking sleep from her eyes, stiff from the awkward position on the chair. She saw Mila awake and smiled, a shy, tired curve of her mouth that looked more like hope than anything she'd managed in days. For a moment, the sisters only looked at each other, as if trying to confirm that they had truly survived, that they were still themselves. Then Rose stretched, bones creaking, and reached for Mila's hand, their fingers lacing together. A wordless promise that nothing would separate them. Not now. The nurses came and went quietly. One checked Mila's ankle, gentle fingers probing the swollen skin, murmuring soft approval at how the splint had held. Another brought breakfast on a tray, instant oatmeal, apple slices, toast curling with steam. The girls ate slowly, as if every bite might be taken away. Rose saved the smallest piece of toast for Harlow, breaking it into crumbs and sprinkling them at his paws. He woke just enough to lick them from the tile, then lowered his head again, eyes closing in contentment. Elliot arrived just after the sun had cleared the pine trees, looking older than he had the night before, but steadier too. He hovered at the threshold, hat in hand, unsure of his place. But when Mila looked up and smiled, a quiet, accepting smile, he stepped inside. He asked about the night, about pain, about the dreams that still haunted children at dawn, and the girls answered as best they could. But it was their silence that spoke loudest. The hush that filled the room now was different than the one that had haunted the woods. This was the hush of something growing. Later that morning, the doctor, a middle-aged woman with gentle hands and tired eyes, pronounced Mila well enough to leave, so long as she was careful and stayed off her ankle for a week or more. There was a flurry of discharge forms, instructions scribbled in slanting script. A wheelchair borrowed from the hallway. Rose packed the girls' meager things into a paper bag. The nurse gave them each a pair of donated socks, pink for Mila, blue for Rose. Harlow watched it all, head resting on his paws, tail thumping whenever one of the girls glanced his way. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, washed new by the rain. Elliot's truck sat in the parking lot, a battered pickup older than either of the girls, its paint dulled to a soft, honest gray. He opened the passenger door and helped Mila up, settling her gently onto the seat. Rose climbed in after, folding her knees and pressing close so her sister wouldn't jostle her ankle. Harlow leapt into the back, turning twice before settling into the blanket Elliot had left for him, a king presiding quietly over his domain. The drive was silent at first. The girls stared out at the world remade by the storm, the shimmer of light on wet roads, the swollen river, the crows drying their wings on telephone wires. Elliot drove slowly, one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting in his lap, his face composed but not hard. Every few minutes he glanced at the girls in the rearview mirror. Each time he found Rose watching him, a question in her gaze he could not yet answer. They turned off the main road onto a lane lined with mossy stones and tangled blackberries. Elliot's house appeared, small and neat, smoke curling from the chimney in a shy, hopeful way. The front garden was a patchwork of tired perennials and the last faded marigolds of autumn. It did not look like a place where grand stories happened. It looked simply like shelter. Elliot helped Mila inside, cradling her gently as he would have carried his own daughter, years before. Rose followed, pausing in the doorway to take in the soft clutter. Books stacked 2 and 3 deep on shelves, muddy boots by the door, a coat rack heavy with scarves. The air smelled of bread and wood smoke, with a hint of the lavender sachet tucked behind the old heater. He settled Mila on the worn couch, propping her leg on a pillow. Harlow curled beside her, tail draped over her foot, as if to guard it from further harm. Rose explored in quiet circles, running her hand along the backs of chairs, peering into the kitchen, glancing back to be sure she was not in the way. In the corner, she found a battered box of crayons and a stack of paper. She took one sheet and, after a long pause, began to draw. Her picture was of a house, uneven but bright, with a single window glowing yellow and a large black dog at the door. A stick figure stood beside the dog, hand outstretched, not to command, but to welcome. When she finished, Rose taped the drawing to the fridge. Elliot, coming in from the porch, saw it and stopped. He looked at Rose, then at the drawing, then nodded, his lips pressed together in a line that trembled with something too old for words. For the first time in years, he turned on the kitchen light before the sun had fully risen. Mila, already half asleep again, murmured, "It's warm here." Rose smiled, her eyes drifting closed. Harlow lay watchful, ears twitching, the quiet guardian of a home that, at last, had begun to heal. Spring came slow to Cedar Valley. It arrived first in hints, the air a little softer, the daylight lingering longer at the edges, the last of the frost retreating to shadows where old leaves still held secrets of winter. Inside Elliot's small house, the changes settled more gently, woven into the fabric of ordinary days. The kitchen became the center of the world for Rose and Mila. The first morning after their return, Elliot rose early and stoked the stove, filling the room with the scent of wood and something warm, flour, apples, cinnamon. The girls stirred from their dreams as the house creaked to life. Mila limped into the kitchen, Harlow at her side, each step more sure than the last. Rose joined her, hair still wild from sleep, eyes blinking in the golden spill of sunrise across the floor. Elliot did not speak much, but his hands were steady. He peeled apples, diced them into neat cubes, and pressed dough into a battered pie dish. Mila watched, chin resting on her arms at the table, mesmerized by the simple magic of bread rising, apples softening in the pan. Rose fetched a glass of milk for Mila, remembered to set aside the blue mug for Elliot, and wiped crumbs from the counter, the way she had seen in houses where she'd been a guest, never a resident. Breakfast was quiet, a slice of apple pie for each, the crust uneven but perfectly golden, Harlow curled beneath the table, tail thumping each time a crumb landed near. Rose ate slowly, chewing each bite as if committing it to memory, while Mila smiled for the first time since the woods. She pressed a bit of apple into Harlow's mouth, giggling as he nuzzled her hand in thanks. Later, Elliot helped Mila practice walking the length of the hallway, her legs still stiff in the makeshift cast. Each step was a triumph, a declaration that she would not stay broken. Rose was her shadow, offering a hand but never pushing. The dog watched from the doorway, rising only when Mila's courage flagged, pressing his muzzle gently to her hip, lending his silent encouragement. Outside, the yard showed signs of new beginnings. Together, the three of them raked the last damp leaves from beneath the shrubs. Rose found a worm, fat and pale, and relocated it to a patch of loose soil beside the fence. Mila, still unsteady, perched on a low stool and handed Elliot the seed packets he'd unearthed from the pantry. Carrots, beans, a packet of sunflowers labeled with a faded price and someone else's careful script. Elliot handed her a small trowel. She dug holes, her hands dark with earth, and dropped the seeds in, whispering to each as if promising protection. On sunny afternoons, Rose sat on the porch steps, her feet bare, a battered library book open on her knees. She read aloud, halting and quiet, the stories drifting into the yard with the breeze. Mila listened, head resting on Harlow's broad side, sometimes slipping into sleep. In these moments, Elliot worked quietly in the background, patching a loose shingle on the shed roof, mending the hinge on the gate, oiling the old garden tools. The house, once silent and self-contained, now echoed with the soft noises of life. A laugh, a squeak of a chair, the scrape of chalk on the walkway. Dinners were small but complete. Roasted potatoes, a jar of beans Elliot had canned last fall, a loaf of bread split 3 ways. On Fridays, they made a simple cake, flour, eggs, whatever fruit was left. The girls decorated it with sprinkles, uneven and cheerful. At the table, they bowed their heads, not to pray, but in gratitude for the meal, the company, the day survived. As spring deepened, Mila grew stronger. She shed her bandages, first the heavy wrap, then the lighter brace until her steps, though cautious, held none of winter's fear. Rose began to draw again. Not just houses, but people and animals, moments she saw and wanted to remember. Elliot reading on the porch, Harlow curled in a patch of sun, Mila asleep in the window seat. The drawings filled the fridge and then the hallway, the house slowly papered with evidence of presence, of belonging. Some nights, Elliot sat in the front room long after the girls had gone to bed, watching the lamp's glow fall in soft pools across the rug. He did not always know what to do with so much quiet, now filled not with absence but with the memory of children's laughter echoing up the stairs. Sometimes he caught his own reflection in the window, surprised to find a man no longer alone. On the evening of Mila's birthday, the date chosen by consensus, not memory, The three of them sat together at the small kitchen table, a store-bought candle flickering atop a lopsided cake. Rose sang quietly, her voice thin but earnest, while Elliot struck a single match. Mila squeezed Harlow's paw in her lap, eyes shining in the candlelight. When Elliot asked her to make a wish, she shook her head, glancing at her sister and the dog, then whispered, "I already have everything." Later, as dusk gathered outside, the family, because that is what they were, for all their imperfect edges, spread a blanket in the backyard and lay together beneath the budding trees. Harlow sprawled beside them, nose twitching at the scents of grass and distant rain. Rose watched the sky, her head on Elliot's shoulder, fingers absently stroking Mila's hair. Nothing was perfect. The house still leaked in spring storms. The garden grew wild in patches. Some nights, the old grief returned, raw and sharp as ever. But in the morning, there would be bread to bake, seeds to water, a new drawing to hang, another day to live as best they could. And through it all, through the bright mornings and gray afternoons, through the laughter and the tears and the soft, persistent return of hope, Harlow remained, the steadfast shadow at their side, anchoring them to this life, to each other, to the slow, miraculous work of healing. The last frost passed, and Cedar Valley took on the pale green of new grass and the watery yellow of dandelions threading along the roadside. In Elliot's small house, change arrived not as an event, but as a quiet, ongoing presence. Sunlight slanting deeper into the kitchen, the hush of evening broken by the steady thump of Harlow's tail, a pair of voices raised in soft laughter at the kitchen table. On the first true spring evening, Elliot found himself standing in the doorway of the girls' bedroom. Mila and Rose had fallen asleep beneath a patchwork quilt, the faint scent of lavender sachets drifting in the cool air. A battered book with a folded page lay at Mila's side. Rose's latest drawing was tacked above the bed, a house with crooked windows, a dog stretched long beneath them, and 3 stick figures holding hands in a crooked line. The night outside was gentle, not quite dark, just the blue hush before the stars. He lingered there, not out of worry but in wonder. How many nights had passed in this house in emptiness, echoes rattling in the pipes, the lights switched off early for lack of anything worth waiting for. Now the house felt full in ways that could not be measured, by footsteps in the hallway, by a forgotten mug at the sink, by Harlow's sleeping breaths heavy on the kitchen tiles. Downstairs, Harlow was sprawled in his usual spot by the back door, muzzle on his paws, his body relaxed in the way only an animal can manage after long vigilance. The years showed in the gray at his jaw, the stiffness in his stride. But in this moment, the old shepherd was simply at rest, a part of the house, like the faded rug and the battered clock. Elliot crossed the kitchen, refilling the kettle as he'd done 1,000 times before. As the water heated, he watched the garden through the open window. The seedlings Rose and Mila had planted were beginning to poke through the earth, brave and foolish. A bluebird flashed across the yard, scattering a pair of squirrels from the fence. It was nothing remarkable, and yet it felt as if the world was offering a benediction. He poured the tea and carried the cup to the back steps, where the night breeze tugged at his sleeves. He sat quietly, letting the silence settle in. It was not the silence of loneliness, sharp and empty, but the hush of contentment, the rare peace that grows from shared struggle and the willingness to stay. As darkness deepened, Harlow rose and stretched, his paws padding softly over the floor. He came to Elliot's side, sat heavily, and pressed his head against Elliot's knee. The touch was unceremonious, but Elliot reached down and let his hand rest in the thick ruff of fur, feeling the warmth and weight of the dog's presence. For a long time they sat together, listening to the faint, distant sounds of the town. A car door, the whine of a screen door, the hum of a neighbor's television. Inside, a light clicked on upstairs. Elliot listened to the girls' voices. Low, comforted, the sweet confusion of childhood drifting towards sleep. He closed his eyes, breathing in the night air and the faint, familiar musk of Harlow beside him. Memory slipped through his mind. Old griefs, the faces he'd lost, the floodwaters, the nights of waiting and hoping and not knowing if anything would ever feel whole again. He realized slowly that healing hadn't come all at once or even with certainty. It had arrived in pieces, the slow return of laughter, the stubborn roots of new plants. The small hand pressed into his on the first morning Rose and Mila called this place home. He thought of the pain carried quietly by each of them, the girls with their lost childhood, Harlow with his old wounds, himself with years of learning to live after loss. None of them were whole, but together, they'd built something gentle from broken things. The old clock in the hallway chimed the hour. Upstairs, the house was settling into stillness. Elliot stood, stretched, and turned off the porch light. Harlow followed, footsteps soft as dusk. In the quiet of the living room, Elliot paused, looking once more at the photograph on the mantel, one of those he'd been afraid to look at for so long. He didn't feel the old ache now, only gratitude for the chance to begin again. He crouched by Harlow's bed, brushing a hand across the old dog's head, murmuring a wordless thank you. Then he turned toward the stairs, pausing only to look back as Harlow curled into his blanket, sighing deep into the dark. "Good night, friend," Elliot whispered, voice barely a breath, but Harlow's ears twitched in answer. It was enough. Upstairs, the girls slept in gentle, easy breaths, their dreams filled with gardens and dogs and the steady heart of a house that had learned, at last, to open. Outside, a breeze shivered the first leaves on the maple tree. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled, a reminder of what they'd all survived, of storms past and storms to come. But for this night, in this small house at the edge of Cedar Valley, there was only the soft light of kindness. There was only the hush of a family, imperfect and stitched together by chance and choice, and the silent, faithful grace of those who stay. And as the night deepened, as peace took root and grew, Elliot let himself believe. "Harlow, we have found each other. Here at last we are home." As the seasons turned and the small house at the edge of Cedar Valley filled with laughter, quiet work, and the steady heartbeat of an old dog, something quietly remarkable took root, a belief that even lives marked by loss and loneliness can grow new beginnings. The wounds each carried did not disappear, but together they learned to let kindness and patience stitch a family from broken pieces. Sometimes it is not grand gestures, but the small, persistent acts of staying, sitting in silence, sharing a meal, planting a seed, that gently heal what once felt beyond repair. If this story found a quiet place in your heart, I invite you to share what home means to you in the comments below. Your reflections might comfort someone else, just as a loyal dog's presence or a gentle word once did here. And if you believe in the power of ordinary goodness, I hope you'll stay with us for more stories that remind us. No one is ever truly lost, as long as someone chooses to stay.